Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Mailflow Configuration. Let's talk about the Mailflow feature. Ensuring mail can flow properly within your organization may include a variety of items, including accepted domain configuration, email address policies, send connectors, and receive connectors. Now you might be thinking, well, what do you mean Mailflow? When someone in my organization sends an email, I want it to either go to someone else in the organization or head out to the internet and find the other person that they're emailing. And when a person sends mail to my organization, I want it to come into my organization and get to the mailbox for that individual. And perhaps in your mind and for your situation, that's Mailflow. And you're right. However, there are times, unique circumstances, where Mailflow may actually be something other than that. It might involve, let's say, having a partner organization where mail flows back and forth between your organization and the partnered organization. It might involve having a mail server that accepts email for more than just your domain, but perhaps other accepted domains. We have much to discuss, so let's get started. Starting with accepted domains. Accepted domains is an SMTP namespace that the Exchange organization can send or receive email for. There are three different types, and these include an authoritative accepted domain. That's where email is delivered to a recipient in this Exchange organization. There's internal relay. That's where email is delivered to recipients in this organization or relayed to an email server outside the organization. And then there's external relay, where email is relayed to an email server outside the Exchange organization. Now, with an authoritative domain, mail is handled for the recipients within that domain. So, an authoritative accepted domain is one in which email comes in and it goes to a mailbox and is handled by that organization. So, in our case with SpyTech Prime, we pretty much have an authoritative accepted domain. If someone sends an email to us, it goes into a mailbox within our organization. Now at the same time, you can have more than one SMTP namespace, and mailboxes can be hosted on an Exchange server with different SMTP addresses. So you can have multiple authoritative domains within your organization. And that just goes to show you the versatility of an Exchange server in that you might have an Exchange server that has multiple authoritative accepted domains, and individuals within that organization might have different SMTP namespaces depending on which side of the organization they work for, or it might be multiple organizations all under one Exchange server. So Exchange is quite flexible in that regard. As we mentioned already, relay domains come in two flavors, internal and external. When a person sends an email that is by namespace supposed to come to your Exchange server, which means based upon the namespace, the DNS servers out on the internet say, yep, here's the direction where that email should go, and it points it to your Exchange server. Well, if that email is not for an internal mailbox, in other words, when the Exchange server receives that email and it looks and it realizes that it was not sent to an authoritative accepted domain, well, then it looks for a relay domain for that email. If it has information for a relay domain, in other words, if it knows of an internal or external relay that it can send it to, then it will send that email along. Let's jump over to our Exchange server and let's take a look at our accepted domain. Alright, so here we are on our Exchange server. We already have the EAC open and we're under recipients. Now everything we're talking about is under Mailflow. So if we click Mailflow, we can see here that we have rules, delivery reports, but it's really these last four that we want to talk about. Accepted domains, email address policies, receive connectors, and send connectors. So accepted domains, here we have the one accepted domain. Note that by having it selected, we can see here on the right that it is an authoritative domain, which means we will accept email into our organization, into this Exchange server, for anyone that has a mailbox that is for spytechprime.com. Of course, they have to have a mailbox. So that mail, if it comes in and there's no mailbox, well, it's not going anywhere. But as long as we have the mailbox, we are an accepted authoritative domain. Now, if we double click this domain, we see here the name, we see the accepted domain name there, and then again the three options: authoritative domain, internal relay domain, where it's either delivered to recipients in this Exchange organization or relayed to an email server outside this organization, and then external relay domain, where email is relayed to an email server outside this Exchange organization. So we have options. In the case of SpyTech Prime, we simply need a single accepted domain that's authoritative. So we're not going to be making any changes to this. Even when we talk about it from a scenario perspective, we're not going to set up anything different from what we have here. It is good, though, for you to understand, even in a simple arrangement where you only have a single accepted authoritative domain, that you do have flexibility with Exchange, and you can establish other methods for mail flow by establishing other accepted domain types, like an internal or external relay domain. Alright, let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk a little bit about email address policies. Let's talk for a moment about email address policies. Recipients are mail-enabled Active Directory objects. Email address policies generate the primary and secondary email addresses for recipients. The default policy is a combination of the user's alias, the @ symbol, and the default accepted domain. You can make changes to the email address policy, like firstname.lastname or lastname.firstname@company.com or firstinitial.lastname, and so on. So perhaps you've wondered why some companies have a pattern for their email addresses like firstinitial.lastname, whereas other companies might go with the full firstname.lastname or something along those lines. And it's really just a matter of preference. There is no right or wrong way to do it. It's just that a decision is made in terms of what is more professional and what is best for your particular company. So this is something that's handled within the email address policy. Let's jump over to our server and let's take a look at the email address policy that is in place by default on our Exchange server. So as far as the email address policy for our organization, we can click Email Address Policies. We see here the default policy, the email address format, the primary SMTP address namespace here, and then it includes all recipient types. And there's really not much to discuss here in this respect. We can open this up and take a look at the policy. It's the default policy. It runs at the lowest. In other words, if there are other policies, this will not take precedence. This will be the lowest in terms of sequence with other policies. We can see email address format. You can see it's a simple SMTP type. The address format uses at spytechprime.com. Okay, but if we edit this, we get a little bit more information here. Here's where we can see that we have it as, in this case, the alias, the user alias at spytechprime.com. And we can change this. Here's where we can change it to John Smith, J. Smith, John S. Smith, John. So we can make it any number of different options. In this case, we prefer it with just the alias, so we're going to leave it as that. If we needed to, we could create an additional policy, a better policy that we would have a different address format. So if we cancel out of here, and let's say we did want to make a change, we click the plus sign for a new email address policy. We give it a name. We provide an email address format, and that's where we would select the type of format that we want for the email address. In our case, we're just fine with it at SpyTech Prime as is. We appreciate the alias being used with at SpyTech Prime, so we're going to leave this policy as it is. And now let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk about send connectors and receive connectors. So another aspect of mail flow, and actually a very important aspect, is the send connector. Now send connectors deliver outgoing mail to the next hop. Now that hop could be the internet. That hop could be a smart host, which is a relay server. That hop could be an edge transport server or some other form of anti-spam or antivirus server. That hop could be a partner that you send email directly to, as opposed to having a send connector that sends it to the internet and it lands into the email address boxes of your partner organization. Now you might say, well, why would I have a send connector for a partner organization if I could just send all outgoing email to the internet and have it be delivered that way? Well, one of the reasons is because you can establish different security mechanisms on send connectors. So you can have one between a partner that would be stronger perhaps, and it would be stronger because you might also allow for different content to go through. You might allow for larger sizes in terms of the mail size restrictions for sending email. And so you can have different send connectors for different organizations that you're partnered up with. However, in our case, we're looking at a very simple situation where we just need to establish a way for email to go out to other organizations, go out to the internet. So how do we do that? Well, when we take a look at the send connectors in our MailFlow settings, you're going to see that there are no send connectors by default. So we're going to have to create a send connector. And you'll see that there are a couple of different types that we can create. We can create a send connector that does use a smart host, or we can use one that uses DNS settings and sends it right out to the internet. When email needs to go out to the internet, outgoing email, it will use DNS servers, it will check for MX records, and it will send mail directly to those other email servers. However, it's interesting to note that without send connectors, we're still able to send email to individuals within the organization. How is that possible? Well, mailbox servers by default have implicit invisible send connectors, and these allow the mailbox servers to communicate with others within the organization based upon the Active Directory site topology. So again, if we want mail to flow outside of our organization, we have to configure a send connector. Now let's take a moment and just discuss the difference between the DNS send connector that uses MX records and a smart host send connector. So when you configure a send connector to use DNS settings, which is the standard method for sending email, Exchange will look for the MX record of that domain where that mail is going to, and it attempts to contact directly, to send that email directly to the Exchange server on the other side or the messaging server on the other side. With a smart host send connector, Exchange sends outgoing email to another email server, and that server will deliver it to other servers on your behalf. So one way or another, your email will get to its destination server, but you may decide to go with a smart host at times as opposed to using the DNS MX records. Now why would you do that? Well, if your Exchange server is on a network that's behind an ISP that's giving you a dynamic IP address, like with a home lab environment, oftentimes the DNS connector won't work. So your people will send emails and they'll get bounced back because of some sort of anti-spam protection on the part of the receiver. So these anti-spam solutions, they're just trying to prevent any spam monger from setting up a mail server and just shooting emails out there. So most spam protective solutions will reject your messages, and we'll take a look at this in a moment. So you might decide to go with a smart host. However, with the smart host, you may have to pay for the usage. So if you're testing things at home and you don't have a static IP and your messages are getting rejected, but you still want to test, find a free smart host for testing, like Django. Or even if you have a small business and want to maintain your own Exchange in-house, you can go with a cheap smart host solution. It just takes a little bit of research on different smart host solutions. Now, of course, I'm talking to you as an Exchange administrator. If you really wanted to avoid all of this as a small business, you would go with Office 365 and let someone else worry about the headache. But being that our goal here is to set up Exchange servers, then if you run into this problem where people are getting their emails rejected back, it's probably because you have a dynamic IP address. So you can contact your ISP, you can ask them to ensure that you get a static IP address, and so that you won't be put on the block lists or your IP addressing won't be blocked by the various spam servers, and then see if you're still having the problem. At times it's a different type of problem and a different reason why you're being blocked. You might be on a block list of some sort, and so you have to just kind of work through the problems there to ensure that your mail can get sent through. Let's just jump over to our server for a moment and let's configure a send connector for our organization that uses DNS. And you'll have an opportunity to see what happens when we try to send email directly to another individual that has an anti-spam solution in place and will block that email because in our case, we're sitting behind a dynamic IP address, and so our emails will bounce back without the use of a smart host. Let's take a look. Alright, so here we are back in our Exchange Admin Center. We're under the Mailflow settings, and we have send connectors selected already. And you can see there are no send connectors. That's the default. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click the plus sign, which is for a new send connector. We'll give it a name to start. We'll call it Outgoing Send Connector, something simple, so that we have an easy way to remember what we're creating. In our case, there's only going to be one, so we don't have to worry about partner send connectors and making sure that we have a meaningful, distinguishable name in that sense. In our case, we're only going to have the one. We're not going to establish partner send connectors at this point, so we don't have to worry about it being too meaningful a name. We certainly will know that this is the outgoing send connector because it will be the only one there. And here we can choose the type, and so we'll choose Internet to send Internet mail, and we'll click Next. And here we can see where we can choose between a DNS or a smart host send connector. So the default is the DNS one, MX record associated with recipient domain. That's how mail will be sent, and we'll leave it at this. If we wanted to create the smart host one, and we will later, then we would select the second one and put the smart host information in there. So we'll leave it as MX record associated with recipient domain, and we'll click Next. Here we see we have to put in the address space, and so in our case we're actually going to send all outgoing mail through this send connector. So the best way to do that is, instead of putting in an FQDN, where the FQDN would be specific, like if we had a partner that we were going to send email to, in this case, being that we're sending all outgoing mail, we just put an asterisk in the space here. So literally we put an asterisk, and what that basically says is that all email that's not going to another individual within our domain, SpyTech Prime, should be sent out through this send connector. So we leave it at this and we click Save, and we click Next. We have to associate the send connector with a server, so we click the plus sign. In our case, there's only one server, so it will find that server. There it is. We click Add and OK. And then Finish. And here we have that send connector. And so you can see here we have a maximum send message size of 10 megabytes. We can change this, but we don't want to, because actually the policy for SpyTech Prime is to keep it at 10 megabytes. So if we wanted to, we can open this up, and after creating it, now we can go in, and you can see that there are all of these other options that we can start working with now that the send connector is in place. So here we can proxy through client access server, we can set the protocol logging level, we can change the maximum send size if we want, and we can do other things. Delivery, here we can change the settings here, we can change the authentication, scoping, we can change some additional settings here, address space, source server, and so forth. So this send connector is up and running, but remember what we said. We made it a send connector that's using DNS MX records. And in our case, we're actually in a situation where we have a dynamic IP address assigned to our router. So at times that's going to mean that our emails will not make it through. Let's see an example of this. If we click to the administrator's Outlook web app and we click New Mail, we're going to send this email off to peter@trainsignal.com. A simple test email. We click Send. Let's give it a moment. So you can see that the mail is rejected because your IP is in the PBL. That's the policy block list. So the mail services that TrainSignal is using as one of perhaps several different anti-spam solutions, They're using an IP block list provider that's provided by spamhaus.org. And so this is a pretty common block list provider. So because our IP is not a static IP, it's one that is considered kind of fishy there, well, it's blocking this email. So in our case, if we want this email to go through, what would we do? Well, the first thing we would do is probably look at a smart host in order to make sure our email would go through and not be rejected because of the IP address being dynamic. All right, let's jump back over to our slides, and we've talked about send connectors. Let's talk for a moment now about receive connectors. Receive connectors handle all inbound mail. So when we first install Exchange, you'll note that while there are no send connectors, there are several receive connectors. And depending on how you installed Exchange, if you installed the client access server and then the mailbox server, there will be some receive connectors on the client access side and other receive connectors on the mailbox side. So in our case, we installed the Exchange server with both roles together, so we'll see all of the automatically created receive connectors when we go take a look in the Exchange Admin Center. At the same time, however, we might manually create these if, as we said before with send connectors, we need to establish a greater level of control or added security over which servers receive email from a particular IP address or address range. So we can create these receive connectors if we're partnered up with another organization, another company, or another side to the company that we're a part of, perhaps one that has a separate Exchange organization. And so instead of sending email through the internet to get to those individuals and receiving it back through the internet, we can create receive connectors so that the connection is direct between the two organizations. And then, of course, that comes with all of the benefits of being able to establish different unique settings with regard to how that connector will perform, how much the maximum receive size for messages coming in, the type of security. For example, we haven't discussed security just yet, but we can have mutual TLS, which means that we say that, hey, this link, this connection between the two, the send and receive side, is more secure and requires a greater level of authentication between these two servers. So through the creation of send and receive connectors, we can really establish some solid but flexible options for our organization. All right, so if we look at receive connectors here, we can see that there are a variety of different receive connectors that have already been created for us, and each one of these has a different port that it uses. So actually, if we select the different receive connectors, we'll see some information here on the right-hand side, but you have to literally double-click each one in order to see the port number that it actually represents. So here we look, and we click Scoping, and under Scoping you can see the ports that are supported by this receive connector. So depending on the way that we're trying to access the server and the receive connector that's necessary depending on the port, that is where these will all come into play. So actually the one that we're looking for is the default front end. If we open this one up and we go to Scoping, so that's port 25 SMTP. And if we just look at the security here, we can see a couple of things. For example, we can see permission groups, and we can see that anonymous users is there. So we need to make sure that persons can send email through this receive connector and that the email can be sent by anonymous users. Now you can establish other receive connectors that do not allow anonymous users, that may only be able to come from Exchange servers. Maybe you can even turn off the legacy Exchange servers, so you can make other adjustments to these receive connectors to make them stronger and more secure. The same is true here. We can see transport layer security, domain security, mutual TLS, basic authentication, integrated Windows authentication. So these are different options that can be utilized for security mechanisms, and you could turn some of this off if you wanted to make it so that only one method could be used as opposed to all of these different ones. So that's the receive connector there. Now, the receive connector is only one aspect of getting email to come into the organization. The other aspect of things relates to your DNS settings. So let's talk for a moment about DNS settings, and then we'll actually make it as part of our scenario. We'll make sure our DNS settings are configured properly on the external DNS services to make sure that email that's sent to us can come back in through our organization through the receive connector that we have here. The fact of the matter is, we can send email back and forth to each other in our organization all day long using our internal DNS. And we can send email to the internet using an asterisk send connector that pretty much uses DNS in order to find the domains and exchange servers that are out there on the internet for the people that we're sending email to. But how does email get back to us? Now you might say, well, we have receive connectors. We just talked about this. And yes, that's true. We do have to have a receive connector in order to accept that incoming email. However, none of that email will get to us without DNS records established on the internet so that others can now find our organization, our exchange servers, and be able to send mail back to us. And so these are called MX records. So MX records must be created for any domain that you wish to receive email on. And again, your transport servers should be prepared to accept email on that domain. So we need to have those receive connectors, which in our case they're created initially by default, but there may be some configuration settings that we need to establish. If we had multiple companies that accepted mail on our exchange server, we would need to have records for each one of those companies. They can point in the same direction, but ultimately each domain would have to have an MX record set up on an external DNS server so that when persons are trying to send email back our way, those emails can actually make it to our exchange environment. So the MX record, again, is created on your external DNS servers. Alright, so taking a look at our scenario for a moment, we're going to go back to our exchange server and we're going to reconfigure our outgoing send connector to use a smart host. And that's because currently the send connector that we created a moment ago, it uses DNS with MX records and we're getting email bounced back our way. So we're going to just jump back over and go with a smart host. Now, that's not the only reason you would use a smart host. We recall that smart hosts are also good for ensuring that our email doesn't get blocked for any number of reasons. So in our case, it's because we have a dynamic IP address, but other reasons why email might bounce back is if you have a situation where you're on a block list or your domain is on a block list for whatever reason. So going through a smart host can be helpful to avoid those types of problems. In addition, we're going to configure an MX record on the external DNS server. In our case, it's GoDaddy, so we actually already have the settings configured. We're just going to review them and confirm the configuration of the MX record. And then we're going to make sure email can be sent and be received by spytechprime.com. Alright, let's jump over to our server and let's see how we would configure all of this as if we were working in a production environment. Alright, so there are a couple of things we need to do as part of our scenario tasks. The first one is the send connector, but we'll save that for a moment. Let's just take a look here at our DNS settings, because we need to make sure that email can come back our way. Sending email is one part of the game, the other part is making sure it can come back. So here we can see our GoDaddy control panel, and again, for everyone it's going to be a little bit different in terms of what you're going to see with your DNS settings, depending on how you handle them, whether or not you handle the DNS server or you have an ISP handle it. So in this case, if we just scroll down, we can see DNS Manager, we click Launch, and here we can see a few different things. The way this is configured is we have our IP address. This is our public IP address that is actually on the public side of our router. This is the IP address that we configured because it's a public-facing IP address. Now, in order for this to work, mail coming to that IP, here we configure it here, but mail coming to that side of the router, how does it get through the router? Well, you need to configure the port forwarding on the router in order to allow mail to come through the router and make it to your Exchange server. So that's something that you need to configure on the router itself. But as far as the DNS side, you need to make sure that you have an A record for mail, and even though that's not the name of the server itself, that's okay. We just need to make sure that there's an IP address that's configured for mail or something that is different from the @ record itself. So we put that in there. If we scroll down, you can see we have MX records. Here we see the MX record, and it points to, in our case, mail.spytechprime.com. So we put the domain name in there. And so at this point, we have the DNS settings configured very simply because we only have a single Exchange environment, a single direction for our email. If we needed to put in additional records, we could put in different priority settings, and so that would work just fine too. But for a very simple environment like this, the biggest part to this is making sure that first of all we have the proper IP address here, and we do. The second part is to make sure that the router has the configuration set to allow for the forwarding. So if we go over to our router, we can see we can go to set up network connection, set up port forwarding. Here we can see we have the IP address and the port 25 to allow incoming email, and so it will allow emails coming from outside to be sent right through. Make sure you have this enabled because you can create all of the port forwarding you want, but if this is still disabled, whatever your router says, however it's configured, this is an iBoss Pro for business, but if you don't have it enabled, it's not going to forward anything. So once this is configured, you have your DNS settings configured, so when someone tries to send you an email, they know how to send it to your Exchange server. It comes to one side of the router. The router now knows to forward it because it knows the Exchange server's IP address. So when anything comes into it that is SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol oriented, it says, okay, I know what to do with this. It's going to forward it, and it will forward it to the Exchange server. And because the Exchange server has the receive connectors established here for port 25, we know that it is ready to accept email. We know too that that email can be sent from anonymous individuals online because under the security settings, anonymous users have been selected. So we're ready to receive email, but we're still not ready to send it, right? Because we're still working with that send connector that is using DNS MX records to send email out. And that's not going to work because we have a dynamic IP address, and we know that, at least in the case of TrainSignal, email is not going to make it into their organization unless we go through a smart host. So if we click Outgoing Send Connector, double click it so we can edit that, and let's go to Delivery. Let's change this to Route Mail through Smart Hosts. Click Smart Host. Now, in my case, I'm using Django as my smart host. They give you some free smart host support, and so I'm going to use the information they gave me. And that's the cool thing about a smart host. Once you sign in with a smart host, once you choose the smart host you're going to use, they give you the information that you need. And so in this case, I'm going to use relay.django.smtp.net as my smart host. Obviously, for everyone, it's going to be different. You're welcome to check out Django at djangomail.com to see if perhaps they have what you need. And so we click Save. And then for smart host authentication, in my case, we do have basic authentication needed. And so it's my username, and then the password, and we click Save. Alright, so now we've made the changes to our send connector. We also confirmed the configuration on our external DNS. Mail should be able to flow back our way. And we made sure that the receive connectors are all set. So now we go back to the administrator's account. Let's send an email again to Peter at TrainSignal. We click Send. And we might as well delete this because this email doesn't work for us anymore anyway. And you can't see this, but I have my TrainSignal email up, and that email just came through. Let me just bring it over so you can see it. So you can see it came from administrator at Spytech Prime. You can see that's the message we sent. If we click Reply, click Send. And there we go. We now have a fully functional Exchange environment. So that's very exciting. It's always exciting when everything works. It's always a good thing. It doesn't work as easily as you just saw here. Obviously, this is a video, so we can make it work perfectly in a video. But keep in mind that a lot of the points that were given throughout this lesson, they're important points to help you to avoid frustration. Sometimes that frustration may come from your internet service provider if you're trying to determine the proper public IP that you can use for your external DNS records. Sometimes that frustration may come from sending emails and having them bounce back because you're using the DNS MX send connector. So you might want to go through the smart host route in order to avoid those types of problems. So the important thing is, especially when you're trying to set up Exchange from a lab perspective, is that you want it to work and you want to be able to send and receive emails, just to prove to yourself at least that you can make it happen. However, working through the various problems is really an education in and of itself, and it will make you a better Exchange administrator to have gone through some of the frustrations and turmoil that you might see when working with it in a lab environment. It's better to go through these types of things in a lab environment than to do it in a production environment in front of your peers or perhaps your employers. So that's one of the reasons why I always encourage folks, if they're going to learn Exchange properly, they have to set up their own lab environment, and even if you're watching the lessons, it's good to follow along and see if you can duplicate the exact tasks that you're seeing in the lesson itself. So there was certainly a lot to take in this lesson. We hope you found it informative. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in a future lesson.